In the far reaches of the Serengeti, long before iron roads crossed the plains, there stood a village named Mbara, a place where every hut carried stories, every drumbeat echoed memory, and every breeze whispered secrets too ancient for the young to understand. And among those mysteries lived an elderly woman named Mama Litha, respected for her healing knowledge, but feared for her strange rituals. For she spent her nights wandering away from her hut and returning only at dawn, exhausted and trembling, as if waking from a war fought inside the shadows themselves. And though the villagers spoke of her in hushed tones, none dared confront her because old age was sacred, her wisdom deep, and her lineage powerful. But everything changed the evening her daughter Zuri announced she was pregnant, and the elders celebrated. Drums thundered, fires soared, and blessings were offered to welcome a future generation. Yet Mama Litha's face turned pale as river ash, her fingers shaking as she pressed them against her temples, whispering words no one understood. And that same night, as moonlight stretched long and thin like a blade across the cracked earth, a giant serpent slithered through the grass, its scales shimmering with impossible colors, its eyes glowing like burning coals. And it made its way toward Zuri's hut with a slow, deliberate hunger. But before the creature could enter, the village guardian, a blind elder named Kaibali, sensed a disturbance in the air and struck his staff upon the ground, sending a shock through the earth that frightened the serpent away, though none knew what had come except him. And when dawn broke and the village awoke, they found Mama Litha collapsed at the river's edge, her clothes torn, her body covered in dust, and her face drenched with sweat as if she had traveled miles through darkness. And when they carried her home, she refused to explain where she had been, only muttering warnings about a curse born generations before, a curse that demanded repayment in blood, especially the blood of unborn children. And though everyone dismissed her ramblings as the weakness of age, the blind elder Kaibali knew the truth. Someone in the village was turning into a monster under the moon, someone bound to ancient magic, and the unborn child inside Zuri was in terrible danger. For many days after the serpent's first appearance, Bembra village lived under a sky thick with suspicion, fear drifting through the air like smoke from a dying fire. And although no one dared speak openly about the creature, the tension grew every time the sun dipped behind the horizon. Yet the only person who showed no fear was Zuri, whose pregnancy filled her with a warm, glowing hope. But even she could not ignore the strange behavior of her mother, Mama Litha, who spent her days locking herself inside her hut, muttering ancient incantations as if arguing with unseen spirits, and her nights wandering near the forest edge, leaving trails in the dirt that matched the exact serpentine path villagers had discovered earlier. And it was during one of these nights that Kaibali, guided only by his heightened senses and the whispers of the ancestors, followed the disturbance he felt pulsing beneath the earth. And he stopped when he heard the unmistakable sound of scales scraping against stone, a slow, heavy rhythm like something impossibly large moving in the dark. And when he raised his staff to summon spiritual protection, the moonlight revealed a monstrous snake coiling behind a rock, its chest rising and falling as if breathing like a human, its mouth dripping with venom that hissed as it touched the ground, and its eyes glowing fiercely shifted from reptilian hunger to unmistakable human anguish, as though trapped between two worlds, and Kybali, though blind, sensed the truth more clearly than sighted men ever could. This was not a random beast, but a cursed soul, a broken spirit forced into a form it hated. And the moment he recognized it, the serpent lunged, its massive body surging forward with terrifying speed, attempting to reach Zuri's hut. But Kybali slammed his staff onto the earth with all the strength left in his aging bones, releasing a shock wave that cracked the ground like lightning and momentarily stunned the creature, allowing him to chant a binding spell. Yet the spell only lasted seconds because the serpent thrashed violently and broke free, its body twisting like a storm wind before disappearing into the grass, leaving Kybali gasping for breath as the magic drained his strength. And when dawn arrived, the villagers found him slumped against a tree, trembling, whispering that the curse was older than the village, older than the river, older than even the sun stories told by the ancestors. And its purpose was vengeance, vengeance that demanded the destruction of Mama Litha's bloodline. And when Zuri heard this, she collapsed beside Kybali, gripping his hands as fear spread through her like a cold poison. Yet he comforted her, telling her that curses only have power when the living surrender their courage, and she must remain strong for the child inside her. Meanwhile, Mama Litha, overhearing everything from the doorway of her hut, fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she confessed that years ago she had broken a sacred law during her days as a young spiritual apprentice, defying a tribal spirit who guarded the unborn, and in punishment, she was bound to transform into a serpent under the moonlight, forced to hunt her own blood whenever new life formed inside her lineage. And though she fought the transformation every night, her body betrayed her, and her spirit shattered a little more each time she failed to stop herself. And now, with Zuri pregnant, the curse had fully awakened again, stronger and more vicious than ever before, and unless someone stopped the cycle, the unborn child would not survive the next full moon. For the serpent grew hungrier with each passing night, driven by a magic that cared nothing for love, family, or the screams of a grandmother breaking under the weight of a punishment she could never escape. As the moon swelled into its first quarter, glowing like a polished bone above the plains, the villagers prepared for a night unlike any other. For Kybali had warned them that the serpent would grow stronger with each moonrise, and so torches were placed around Zuri's hut. Warriors stationed themselves with spears dipped in protective herbs, and the drummers beat slow, steady rhythms meant to call the ancestors for guidance. Yet even with all this preparation, the air quivered with an unspoken dread, because deep inside her hut, Zuri could feel something unnatural pressing against her spirit, a cold presence that seemed to whisper promises of suffering. And though she placed her hands over her belly and prayed to the river spirits, the ground outside trembled, a vibration so faint that only the most attuned could sense it. And among them was Mama Litha, who sat beside the fire, gripping her chest as agonizing spasms tore through her bones, her fingers twitching, her breath growing shallow, her skin rippling as though something beneath it strained to break free. And she cried out to Kybali, begging him to tie her, to chain her, to bury her, if he must, anything to stop her from becoming the creature she feared. But he shook his head sadly, for the curse was spiritual, not physical, and no chain forged by human hands could restrain a soul condemned by ancient law. And as her screams grew louder, the villagers stepped back, horrified, unsure whether to comfort her or flee, for her eyes were changing, pupils shrinking into serpentine slits, her spine bending as though pulled by invisible hooks, her skin shimmering with patches of scale. And before anyone could intervene, she collapsed into the dust, her body writhing and twisting in ways no human body should, until with one final, violent convulsion, the transformation completed. And where Mama Litha once lay, a massive serpent coiled, her scales gleaming with unnatural colors, her mouth parting to release a hiss that echoed across the entire village like a death cry. And with terrifying speed, she lunged toward Zuri's hut, guided by the curse's blood hunger, smashing through the warriors' spears as if they were reeds, scattering torches and sending flames, licking up the sides of nearby huts. And Zuri, hearing the chaos outside, pressed herself into a corner, trembling as the serpent's shadow stretched across her doorway. But before the creature could enter, Kaibali struck the ground with his staff, summoning a protective circle of ancestral energy around the hut, a shimmering barrier that the serpent slammed into again and again, each collision rattling the earth like thunder. And though the barrier held, Kaibali's strength began to fade, his breath coming in sharp, painful gasps as the magic drained him, and villagers watched helplessly as the serpent's eyes, both monstrous and sorrowful, glowed brighter with every strike, torn between hatred and grief, fury and regret. Because, though the beast wished to devour the unborn child, a small, dying fragment of Mama Litha's human soul screamed in silent torment within its monstrous shell. But the curse's hunger was stronger than sorrow, and with one final, explosive surge, the serpent shattered the barrier, sending Kaibali flying backward into the dust, unconscious. And Zuri let out a scream that tore through the night. But just as the serpent surged into the hut, the unborn child inside her pulsed with a sudden burst of spiritual light, a radiant force that blasted outward, throwing the serpent across the village square, its body slamming into a tree with bone-shaking force. And as the creature writhed in pain, the drums stopped, the wind died, and every villager stared in stunned silence. For no one, not even the elders, had ever heard of an unborn child wielding ancestral power. And though the serpent recovered quickly, retreating into the tall grass with a furious hiss, everyone knew the truth now. This was only the first night, and the curse had just begun to awaken powers far older and far darker than anyone had imagined. The morning after the serpent's brutal attack arrived with a heavy stillness that felt unnatural, as if even the sun hesitated to rise over Mbara. And while the villagers repaired shattered spears and smoldering huts, Zuri sat inside her home, trembling, her hands resting over her stomach where she had felt that impossible burst of power the night before. A light that did not come from her, but from the unborn child within her. And though she tried to make sense of it, fear wrapped around her heart like a tightening vine, because she knew her baby was no ordinary child. Meanwhile, the elders gathered around the unconscious Kaibali, whose breathing was shallow and uneven, his strength nearly drained by the protective magic he had summoned. And as they tried to revive him with sacred herbs, he finally awoke. whispering one phrase that sent a ripple of disbelief through the entire council. "The child is chosen," he said, his voice barely audible. "The ancestors have placed their power in the unborn, so it may fight the curse that seeks to destroy it." And with those words, the elders realized that the battle was no longer between a grandmother and her unborn grandchild, but between ancient forces, one born from spiritual punishment, the other from divine protection. And Ziri, hearing the elders' discussions, felt a strange mixture of pride and terror, for she could not comprehend why the ancestors would place such tremendous responsibility on a child who had not yet even entered the world. And while everyone in the village struggled to process this revelation, Mama Litha, trapped in her serpent form beneath the roots of an ancient baobab tree, wrestled with her dual nature, her monstrous instincts urging her to hunt, while the shattered remnants of her human soul screamed in anguish, begging to stop, trying to claw her way back into control. But the curse wrapped around her mind like chains forged from centuries of sorrow, leaving her powerless to resist. And as the day passed, the serpent's glowing eyes dimmed with exhaustion, yet its hunger continued to grow, pulsing through its veins with every beat of the sun. And when night approached, the transformation back into human form began, her serpent flesh melting into skin, her bones twisting until she collapsed on the forest floor as Mama Litha, once again, sobbing with bloodied hands, unable to bear the knowledge that she had nearly killed her own grandchild. But even in her human form, she could feel the curse whispering inside her skull, telling her that the next night would be more violent, that her serpent self would not retreat so easily, and that she would tear through the village until she completed her doomed purpose. So she dragged herself back to Mabra and fell at Kaibali's feet, begging him to end her life before she transformed again, but he refused, telling her that no curse could be broken by death, that her spirit would simply continue the cycle in the afterlife. Instead, he proposed a dangerous alternative, a ritual known as the breaking of shadows, one so ancient and forbidden that even the elders whispered about it with trembling breaths, because it required confronting the spirit responsible for the curse face to face, not in the physical world, but in the other realm where ancestral shadows lived. And to perform the ritual, they would need the unborn child's spiritual light as a guide, something no living person had attempted before. And though Zuri froze at the idea of risking her child's safety, she also knew the truth: if they did nothing, the serpent would return stronger the next night, and the barrier that failed once would fail again, and the entire village would burn under the curse's hunger. So, with a heart heavy as stone, she agreed, placing her hands on her belly as the ancestors listened from beyond the veil. And as night finally fell, the moon rising with an ominous red tint, Kaibali prepared the ritual circle, drawing ancient symbols in white ash, placing ancestral stones around Zuri, and lighting sacred herbs whose smoke twisted into faces that whispered warnings, while the villagers watched in silence, knowing they were about to witness a battle not of spears or strength, but of spirits, legacies, and the unseen forces that had shaped their world since the beginning of time. As the ritual began under the blood-tinted moon, a heavy wind swept across Embar, extinguishing every torch except the single fire burning at the center of Kaibali's ritual circle. And the villagers gathered in absolute silence, watching as the old shaman lifted his trembling hands toward the sky, chanting words so ancient they had not been spoken aloud for generations. And as the chant intensified, the symbols drawn in white ash around Zuri began to glow with a soft, pulsating light, responding to the power that lay dormant inside her unborn child. And Zuri gasped as she felt the baby shift inside her with unnatural strength, not in pain, but in awakening, as if preparing itself for a journey far older than its own existence. And suddenly the world around them began to blur, the edges of the village dissolving like smoke, the earth shaking beneath their feet while the sky flickered between crimson and black, until the ground split open into a swirling pool of shadows that spiraled upward, wrapping around Zuri Kaibali and the unconscious form of Mama Litha, pulling their spirits free from their bodies and dragging them into the other realm, a place where time did not flow forward but twisted like braided vines, and where the land was shaped by memories, fears, and forgotten truths. And when Zuri opened her eyes, she found herself standing in a vast twilight plain where the sky was neither day nor night, where the ground shimmered like dark glass, and where distant mountains shifted in and out of existence as though breathing, and beside her stood Kaibali, his spirit form younger, stronger, unburdened by age, while Mama Litha appeared whole and uninjured, though her shadow cast on the ground shimmered like a serpent waiting to break free. And as the three of them stood surrounded by flickering ancestral silhouettes, a deep, thunderous voice echoed through the plain, shaking the air. "Daughter of the forbidden oath," it roared, "you return to face the price of your defiance." And out of the swirling darkness emerged the spirit responsible for the curse Nagolo, the guardian of unborn souls. A towering figure with horns made of starlight, eyes like burning coals, and a body covered in shifting symbols representing the countless generations he had watched over. And his presence alone bent the ground beneath him, forcing Zuri to her knees, while Mama Litha trembled violently, unable to look at him. And Nagolo reminded her of the ancient sin she once committed as a young apprentice. She had stolen a forbidden blessing meant only for those with pure lineage, attempting to gain power to heal her dying husband. But in doing so, she had severed a sacred thread of life, creating an imbalance in the realm of unborn spirits. And for that, she was condemned to transform into a serpent whenever life formed in her bloodline, destined to destroy what she once tried to save. And though Mama Litha begged for forgiveness, her tears falling like shards of light onto the dark glass beneath her feet, Nagolo remained unmoved, declaring that balance could not be restored by sorrow, only sacrifice. And he turned his blazing gaze toward Zuri's unborn child, recognizing the ancestral light inside it as the only force capable of challenging him. And as his shadow stretched toward her womb, Zuri felt a fierce protective energy erupt within her spirit, the unborn child answering the threat with a radiant pulse that pushed back the guardian's darkness, creating a shockwave that rippled across the entire realm. And seeing this, Kaibali stepped forward, raising his staff, which shone brighter here than in the physical world. And he demanded a trial in ancient rite, long forgotten, arguing that the curse had already taken more than enough from Mama Litha, that the unborn child bore no guilt for sins committed before its time, and that the ancestors themselves had chosen to intervene. At first, Ngolo resisted, his voice cracking the sky with fury. But as the light from the child grew stronger, illuminating the shadows and revealing the forgotten spirits of Litha's ancestors standing behind her in silent solidarity, the guardian paused, for the ancient laws bound even him, and he agreed to the trial. Mama Litha would face the truth of her sin. The unborn child would face the weight of its destiny, and Ziri would face the terror of protecting life in a place where death had no meaning. And as the ground beneath them transformed into a vast circle of swirling light and darkness, signaling the beginning of the trial, Ziri grasped her belly and whispered to her child, begging it to hold on, for whatever awaited them next would decide not only their fate, but the fate of every generation born from their bloodline. As the realm of shadows reshaped itself into the ancient circle of judgment, the ground beneath Zuri, Kaibali, and Mama Litha split into swirling patterns of light and darkness, each glowing symbol representing a generation of their bloodline. And the sky above dimmed into a storm of shifting spirits, their eyes watching with solemn expectation as the guardian of unborn souls raised his colossal hand, summoning a wind that roared like 1,000 crying infants, the sound echoing through the vast twilight plain with such force that even the ancestral mountains trembled. And as the wind settled into a heavy silence, Ngolo commanded that the trial begin, declaring that each of the three would face a challenge drawn from the deepest part of their lineage, the sin of the past, the danger of the present, and the destiny of the future. And failure of any would seal the curse forever, condemning Mama Litha to remain a serpent until death, and ensuring the unborn child would never draw a first breath. And before Zuri could protest, the ground beneath Mama Litha cracked open, swallowing her into a chamber of memories where she stood face to face with her younger self, the ambitious apprentice who once defied the sacred laws, whose arrogance led her to steal the forbidden blessing. And as both versions of her stared into each other's eyes, they were forced to relive the moment she chose power over humility, the moment she ripped a fragment of life force from the guardian's altar, breaking a thread that connected all unborn spirits. And though the younger Litha justified her actions with love for her dying husband, the older Litha fell to her knees, screaming that love was no excuse for destroying the destiny of another life. And as her confession echoed through the chamber, her young self shattered into dust, symbolizing the release of her long-buried shame. Meanwhile, Kaibali's trial emerged in the form of a colossal shadow that rose behind him, a spirit of cowardice from his past. A moment when he had failed to protect a child lost to sickness long ago. A moment that haunted him even after he became the respected village guardian. And the shadow mocked him, growing larger with every remembered regret. But Kaibali lifted his glowing spirit staff and struck the ground, declaring that courage was not the absence of failure, but the decision to rise after it. And with that, the shadow broke apart like thin glass, leaving him standing taller, restored by the ancestors' acknowledgement of his resolve. And then came Zuri's trial, the most dangerous of all four, the darkness. Beneath her feet rose into a monstrous form, larger than Ngolo himself. A swirling mass of serpents made from her deepest fears, each serpent representing every nightmare she had imagined, losing her child, being hunted alone in the night, watching her mother devoured by the curse. And as the serpents slithered toward her, their hissing filling the realm with a chilling sound, Zuri felt her strength falter, her knees shaking, her heart pounding. But inside her womb, the unborn child pulsed with radiant warmth, a heartbeat that echoed through the shadows like a bell of light. And Zuri, placing her hands over her belly, allowed that warmth to fill her entire spirit body. And once it reached her fingertips, she raised her hands toward the serpents, releasing a wave of ancestral light so intense that the realm itself shook, and the serpents dissolved into shimmering dust that drifted upward into the sky, forming a glowing constellation that symbolized hope rather than fear. And when the 3 trials concluded, the ground stitched itself together, lifting Zuri, Mama Litha, and Kaibali back into the center of the judgment circle, where Ngolo stood waiting with unreadable eyes. And though his expression was stern, the air around him shifted, no longer filled with the suffocating weight of punishment, but with the solemn gravity of reevaluation. And after a long silence, he declared that Mama Litha had faced her sin, Kaibali had faced his past, and Zuri had faced her destiny. But one final test remained, one that no ancestor could assist with, one that would determine once and for all if the curse could be broken. Mama Litha, in her serpent form, must choose to protect the unborn child rather than destroy it, resisting the hunger that had enslaved her for decades. And only if she succeeded could the balance be restored. And as Ngolo raised his hand, summoning the transformation once more, the realm of shadows darkened into silence, preparing for the final confrontation between a grandmother's curse and a grandmother's love. As Ngolo lifted his colossal hand and released the final command, the realm of shadows twisted into a spiraling vortex of dark wind, ancestral whispers rising like a storm as Mama Litha's spirit form convulsed violently, her bones cracking, her skin rippling as the curse surged through her with a ferocity greater than any night in the physical world. Because here, in the spiritual plane, the transformation was not restrained by flesh, it was pure, brutal magic unfolding in its rawest form. And within seconds, her human shape collapsed into a molten flow of shifting scales, elongated limbs, and writhing energy until she re-emerged as the massive serpent that had terrorized Ambara. Except here she was 10 times larger, coiling around the judgment circle like a living storm, her fangs glistening with venom, her eyes burning with a mixture of sorrow and murderous instinct. And as the serpent lifted her head, her gaze fell upon Zuri, who stood trembling but resolute, hands braced over her pregnant belly as the unborn child glowed faintly beneath her skin. And the serpent hissed a sound that shook the entire realm for lunging forward with terrifying speed, her jaws opening wide enough to swallow mother and child in a single strike. But just as she hurtled toward them, the flickering remnants of Mama Litha's human soul screamed within her monstrous mind, fighting desperately against the cursed instinct that pushed her toward her granddaughter. And the serpent froze mid-lunge, its massive body trembling violently as if an invisible battle raged inside it. Ngolo watched in silence, his fiery eyes unblinking. For this was the moment the ancient laws demanded: no magic, no interference, only the truth of a grandmother's heart tested against the darkness she brought upon herself. And the serpent thrashed wildly, smashing the ground, cracking the air, twisting her coils into knots as the curse screamed inside her, urging her to fulfill the purpose she had been damned with. Yet every time her head lowered toward Zuri's glowing belly, the human part of her jerked it away with agonizing effort. And Zuri, tears streaming down her face, stepped forward despite the danger, placing her hand gently on the serpent's massive snout, whispering with shaking breath, "Grandmother, please, choose us." And the warmth of her touch, combined with the soft, luminous pulse of the unborn child, pierced through the storm of hunger, clawing at Mama Litha's cursed mind, awakening memories long buried, the day she held her daughter for the first time, the laughter echoing through their hut during a festival night, the promise she once made to protect her bloodline. And as these memories rippled through her spirit, the serpent collapsed onto the ground, writhing in agony, her body splitting between scales and skin as the curse tried to force her forward again. But this time, the human soul fought back with a strength born not of magic, but of love. And slowly, inch by agonizing inch, the serpent lowered her head, not in attack, but in surrender, coiling protectively around Zuri instead of striking her, her colossal form forming a shield rather than a weapon. And she let out a guttural cry that echoed across the realm, a sound not of hunger but of defiance, as she crushed the curse's will beneath the force of her choice. For the first time since her punishment began, Mama Litha had resisted the serpent's instincts, not through magic, not through fear, but through love for a child she had never met, yet cherished with every fragment of her fractured spirit. And when Ngolo saw this, the storm above them stilled, the spiraling wind calmed, and the twilight sky brightened with ancestral light as he stepped forward, his voice rolling through the realm like thunder softened by dawn. "The balance is restored," he declared. "For the bloodline has chosen unity over hunger, love over legacy, and sacrifice over sin." And with a sweeping motion of his hand, the serpent form dissolved into shimmering dust that wrapped around Mama Litha, reforming her into her human spirit, kneeling, sobbing, exhausted, but free for the first time in decades. The glowing dust then drifted toward Zuri's belly, blessing the unborn child with protection that would endure for generations. And the ground beneath them began to crack open, signaling their return to the physical world, while Ngolo's massive form faded into the cosmic horizon. And as the realm of shadows vanished beneath their feet, Zuri held her grandmother's trembling hands, whispering, "We're going home," though neither knew what awaited them when their spirits returned, only that the curse was broken and destiny had shifted forever. For the first time since the curse had taken hold generations ago, the jungle was utterly still, as if every creature sensed that this night would decide whether the legend of the serpent grandmother would end in blood or in forgiveness. And as the moon climbed full and white like a silent drum in the sky, Amari stood in the sacred clearing, holding the unborn twins inside her like a shield of hope, her heartbeat drumming louder than the insects whispering in the grass, while behind her the elders formed a trembling circle of memory and fear. They all knew that when the moonlight struck the ground, the old woman Mama Zuri would arrive not as the frail, wrinkled grandmother she once had been, but as the monstrous serpent of midnight who had hunted every unborn child in her bloodline for decades, because she believed the spirits had condemned her descendants to bring ruin upon the tribe. a belief twisted by grief, and a curse that fed on her sorrow, like fire feeds on dry leaves. When the first beam of moonlight touched the earth, the bushes shook violently, and there came the scraping hiss of scales against bark, long, slow, ancient, followed by the heavy thud of a massive body slithering through the roots, until the serpent emerged, her body black as storm water, eyes glowing gold like two burning suns. Her jaw split wide enough to swallow a goat whole, and yet despite her monstrous form, the elders saw something in her eyes that was not pure hunger, but the echo of a woman who had once been loved deeply by her family. The serpent towered above Amari, her tongue flicking out, tasting the fear, the life inside her, and she began to coil slowly as if preparing for the final strike. But Amari did not step back. Instead, she raised the wooden charm carved by her late father, the same charm Mama Zuri had given him when he was born, and she shouted over the pounding of her own pulse that she did not believe the curse made Mama Zuri evil but wounded, that the unborn did not come to destroy her legacy but to heal it, that the spirits were not punishing the grandmother but begging her to remember who she had been before sorrow hollowed her out. The serpent froze, every muscle tightening as if the words had pierced through layers of rage, and for a moment the jungle seemed to exhale slowly. Then, in a voice not spoken aloud but felt like a vibration in the bones, Mama Zuri whispered, "I cannot stop the curse. It has consumed me." But Amari stepped closer, placing the charm gently on the serpent's forehead, and the charm burned with a soft white light, making the black scales shimmer like wet silver. The curse fought back, violently winds roared, branches shook. The ground trembled as if the ancestors themselves were wrestling in the soil, but Amari held her ground even as tears streamed down her face from the force of the spiritual storm. And she repeated like a prayer that no bloodline deserved to live in fear of its own grandmother, that no unborn child should inherit terror disguised as protection, and that no woman, however cursed, should die thinking she was a monster beyond redemption. The serpent shrieked in agonizing, metallic sound, and her body writhed as if cracking open from the inside, light spilling from between her scales until her massive form collapsed into the dust, shrinking, melting, reshaping, and when the blinding glow died down, Mama Zuri lay on the earth in her human form, old and fragile, tears cutting lines through the dust on her face, whispering apologies for the lives she had taken, apologies the wind seemed to carry away with gentle mercy. Amari knelt and took her grandmother's trembling hands as Mama Zuri breathed her final words, "Let the children live free," and with a soft exhale, the curse lifted like a cloud dissolving at dawn, leaving the forest peaceful for the first time in decades. As the elders carried Mama Zuri's body home to bury her with honor instead of fear, Amari felt the twins kick softly in her belly, not in terror but in peace, and she understood that the serpent would never return, not in the night, not in the bloodline, not in the shadows, because the curse had ended the moment Mama Zuri chose silence over violence, love over fear, and rest over eternal hunting.